Where do modes and scales come from? It's a question I started thinking about when tutoring a bunch of AP music theory students, a lot of whom were having trouble understanding the concept of modes. This, in combination with considering my own education, got me thinking about the fairly shallow understanding of modes and scales that one might come away with from a standard music theory track. With this video, I want to share some alternate ways I have come to think about modes and scales, integrating 20th century and jazz theory to shed some light on a shadowy concept that only really crystallized for me as I began to work on this video. Let's start by trying to answer another question I've heard a lot recently. What is the difference between a mode and a scale? In unraveling this question, we can gain a deeper understanding of one of the fundamental building blocks of music. Let's start with scales, which can be defined as any consecutive series of notes that form a progression between one note and its octave. This is a super broad definition, which I will depict with a big circle. Basically everything we will be talking about today falls under this definition of a scale. For example, pentatonic scales feature 5 notes that span the octave, while heptatonic scales feature 7 notes. This is one of the ways music theorists categorize scales, by how many notes they use. Okay, so that's scales. What about modes? Well, the first thing you will notice if you take any common mode, let's say the Dorian mode, is that it is also a scale. Here we have 7 notes which span the octave, so we will go ahead and put the Dorian mode within this circle of heptatonic scales. But that is not the whole story. You might have learned that modes are created by starting on different notes of the major scale. This leads to the creation of 7 different scales or modes, sometimes referred to as church modes, diatonic modes, or simply modes of the major scale. Let's start by reviewing this process in a different way than you might have seen before. Here are the notes of the C major scale. In a modal context, we call the C major scale the Ionian mode. What we are actually after here is not the major scale itself, but the set of intervals that make up the scale. If we arrange all 12 pitches in a ring like this, and circle the notes of the C major scale, the arrangement of circles creates what I like to call the diatonic formula. You might have learned this interval pattern as whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Rotating the formula around creates scales in different key signatures. You don't even have to know the different sharps or flats. If you put the root of the major scale on B, you get B major. This process can be thought of as perfect transposition of the diatonic formula. We are not changing anything about its structure, only its placement. From any given rotation of the formula, choosing any of the 7 unique pitches as starting notes produces a unique scale. These related scales are what we refer to as the diatonic modes. To try this out, let's rotate to the G major configuration. As you can see, keeping the fixed interval pattern produces an F sharp. From here, we can choose a starting note, say D. Since this is the 5th mode of the G major scale, and Mixolydian is the 5th mode of the major scale, we know that this is D Mixolydian, with its characteristic lowered 7th. We can use this same process to produce any possible mode. Fun fact, since there are 12 rotations of the formula, and 7 modes of each rotation, that means there are 84 unique transpositions of the diatonic modes. The simplest way to depict the diatonic formula is with a chart like this. It shows the order of whole steps and half steps that make up the formula, without a specific root. Another scale you might be familiar with is the ascending harmonic minor scale, also referred to as the jazz minor scale. It is identical to a major scale except for the lowered third. The interesting thing about this scale is that unlike the diatonic modes, which all share a formula, this scale emerges from an entirely different one. Let's repeat the process to see what I mean. Here are the notes of the A jazz minor scale. Starting on each note will produce a unique mode, many of which are pretty commonly utilized, but none of which precisely match any of the modes of the diatonic formula. Here's the interval formula for this scale. While very similar to the diatonic formula, notice the different placement of the half steps in relation to each other. When we approach modes this way, we see that there is no difference between modes and scales. Any scale can serve as the basis for producing modes, meaning that any scale is itself a mode. The terminology surrounding this topic is so confusing. It is very common in classical theory to refer to the modes of the major scale, or within jazz theory, the modes of the harmonic or melodic minor scale. What we are actually talking about are the modes of given interval patterns, which I refer to as formulas, or could be called a set class. That pattern comes to be represented by the most commonly utilized mode. For example, the major scale is the most commonly used mode of the diatonic formula, so that's what the modes are taught from and often named after. To make things even more confusing, theorists will sometimes use the term diatonic scale as a category which encompasses the diatonic modes. This alludes to the idea of the diatonic formula without addressing it explicitly, and leaves most students of music theory confused. I had never seen a chart like this outside of my own independent study, but I think showing the interval pattern in a circle like this, or arranging the 12 pitches on a clock, commonly done to analyze atonal 20th century music, really helps seed the idea behind modes, which is that there is no fixed route to any given scale. We can start wherever we want. The resulting scale might be useful, it might sound weird, but knowing the option is there unlocks an entire world of scales and scale relationships. What is the difference between modes and scales? In practice, the term scale is used when we are not interested in the related modes that come from the same formula, and that's totally fine. Sometimes it's not important to understand that the altered scale is a mode of the same formula as the jazz minor scale. We just need to know the scale in order to play it on our instrument. Theorists will use the word mode, on the other hand, when relating scales that come from the same formula to each other. That's really it. In a theoretical sense, all modes are scales, and all scales have as many modes as they have notes. To give one final example, the major pentatonic scale has 5 modes, one of those being the minor pentatonic scale. These 2 modes are incredibly common, but the other 3 modes are also super interesting and see use in music from around the world. I wish these relationships between scales, modes, and the underlying formula was made more explicit in music theory education, as I believe it to be an incredibly helpful foundation to understanding any music based on scales, which is most music. I hope this video was helpful and did not come off as complaining. Music education is super challenging when there are so many holdovers from ancient traditions and teaching practices that apply differently to different genres. However, that does not mean there is not room for improvement, and I hope this video helped expand your understanding. This is my first video not geared towards composition, so let me know if you like this style of video and what you would like for me to cover next.